Welcome, everyone. Adam Lafacci, your moderator, joining you here. Thank you so much for joining us for developing an effective collections management policy. This webinar today is produced and sponsored by Learning Times, and we are thrilled to be working with the American Alliance of Museums again to bring you this webinar today. Once again, my name is Adam Lafacci, and you'll be hearing me jump on and off throughout the session. I'll also be moderating in the chat, so if you have any tech issues, you can reach out to me and I'll work with you to get those sorted out. But my fellow moderator today is Greg Stevens. And Greg, would you like to say hello?
I would. Thanks a lot, Adam, and thank you all for joining us for today's program.
Great. And so just a few technical things before we get started with the webinar today. First off, I'd like to point out that we have closed captioning going on down at the bottom of the screen. And that's courtesy of our friends at WGBH in Boston, so thank you so much for joining us today. And in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, you'll notice that we have a chat box, and I've seen a few greetings popping in there, and you're welcome to continue to introduce yourself and say hello there. But also keep in mind that if you have any tech questions, you can type them in there, and I'll respond to you privately to get those sorted out as quickly as we can. And you can also enter your content-related questions in the chat box too. Now, we'll be monitoring those, and we'll be taking note of them as we go. So if you don't get an immediate response, don't worry. We did receive your question, and we'll try to get to them at different pauses during the presentation as we go. So as you're typing your greetings into the chat box there, we'd also love to know how many people are watching this webinar with you from your location. And you'll notice that I've launched an interactive poll up on the screen. And you can click on the little gray bubble that best corresponds to the number of people sitting with you. And it's great to see so many familiar names popping up in the chat box and people joining us from all over the country. I'm also going to take a quick moment to relaunch the handout that I had up before we started with the tech overview here. If you didn't have a chance to download the handout from your email, then you can click on that in the top left-hand corner of the screen now and click on Download File. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Greg Stevens to introduce our presenters for today.
Thanks very much, Adam. I'm really glad to be able to welcome our colleagues for today's presentation. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of really familiar names in our audience today, and that's really exciting to see so many people that we know from various institutions across the country. Today's presentation, our lead presenter, if you will, is going to be Cecilia Walls, who's my colleague down the hall here at the American Alliance of Museums. And Cecilia will be joined today by Jackie Hoff, who's the Director of Collection Services at the Science Museum of Minnesota, Courtney Keel, the Chief Registrar at the Senator John Heinz History Center, and Elise Lecomte, who is the Registrar and Assistant Department Chair in the Department of Natural History at the Florida Museum of Natural History. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to turn the stage over to my colleague Cecilia, who's going to talk a little bit about today's program and where it fits in the overall core documents verification program that's newly launched here at the Alliance. Cecilia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome to everyone in the audience. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that we're having this year, a 5-part series, that is related to the Core Documents Verification Program. It's our new program that is a prerequisite for accreditation, but it's a lot faster and a bit easier to get through than accreditation. It's a way for museums to receive accountability. It's based on the 5 core documents that every museum should have, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. It's a second-party review of those documents, so you get a third party looking at these 5 core documents. It's confirmation that the museum is running in a professional manner, and it's quick and easy. It helps you keep your documents up to date, and it distinguishes your museum as a professional member of the field. So it's one step on your pathway on the continuum of excellence, and that is what this graphic is showing you here, the continuum of excellence, which starts with membership in the Alliance and ends with accreditation. But you could be on any step of the continuum at any time. The Core Documents Verification Program, as I said, it focuses on 5 core documents. They are the Educational Mission Statement, the Institutional Code of Ethics, the Strategic Institutional Plan, Emergency Disaster Preparedness and Recovery Plan, and the Collections Management Policy, which we're going to focus on today. And because the Collections Policy is such a fundamental document for collecting institutions, is why it is one of the core documents. Let me give you just a short rundown of the how we came about developing this program. After years of reviewing documents for the accreditation program, over 40 now, the Alliance identified these 5 as the fundamentals for basic professional museum operations. They embody the core museum values that every museum, regardless of size or type, can develop and approve and implement. So there are required elements for each document, and we'll talk about the required elements for a collections policy a little bit later. So I told you why you should do the Core Documents Verification Program, but let's get into what we're specifically going to be talking about today. The Collections Management Policy, specifically the process of writing this policy and revising it, the required elements as they relate to the Core Documents Verification Program, using this document as a tool for your institution, and relating the policy to your entire institution. And we're also going to provide you with some resources that you can use to develop and implement your policy. So what we hope you're going to get out of the webinar today is determining whether your current collections policy meets the national standards as they exist, and help you find resources to create or strengthen your policy. As Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore explain in their Museum Registration Methods 5th edition, a collections policy provides a framework for management of the collection, helps collection staff identify and minimize risks. So I'm going to turn the stage over to my colleague Elise to go through this definition of a collections management policy.
Okay. Cecilia, can you go to the next slide, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you. You'll see in the next slide that there are certain phrases in the definition circled, and that's because these are important phrases, important issues that you need to consider. The first thing is that the collections management policy is a detailed written statement. It's written. To have it in writing means that it prevents ambiguity, it promotes consistency, and most importantly, it provides accountability. The next phrase is professional standards. And we all know that organizations like AAM and AASLH and AZA, which is the American Zoological Association, all have developed professional standards for the field of museums. And so it's important that our policies relate to these professional standards and best practices. The next phrase is objects. As we all know, most museums are nonprofits, and therefore they hold the collections in trust for their public. So as part of our responsibility for holding the objects in trust, we need to create policies, plans, and procedures related to taking care of the objects and managing collections-related activities. The collections management policy can serve as a guide for the staff. Because it lays down the principles, both ethical and legal, standards and best practices the staff should follow in day-to-day activities related to collections management. So it serves as a guide to the staff, what to do, how to do it. It gives them a map, so to speak. And lastly, the CMP can serve as an information document for the public. It can be used to inform the public of what a museum collects, importantly, what it doesn't want to collect, and then how it manages what it does have. So you should consider all of those things when you're developing your collections management policy. Okay, back to Cecilia.
Now we have an audience question. We'd like to know how many of you out there have a collections management policy?
Great, and you'll all notice that we launched an interactive poll back on the screen there, so just click on the gray bubble that corresponds to your answer.
That looks great. Looks like about half people already have one.
That's great.
Or are working on one.
So I'm also interested in the 17% or so of our institutions who don't have one, what that might mean.
Great, and if you did select no, we'd love to have a little bit more information on that if you'd like to elaborate in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of the screen.
Looks like we have just about everybody's response, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to why a collections management policy is important. Jackie, do you want to cover that one?
I'd be more than happy to. Hi, everybody. So just kind of piggyback on what Elise was talking about earlier, collection management policies can provide so many things. There's a listing that'll pop up here. There we go. And on top of all of the things that are popping up on the screen, it really does promote and force you to follow the rules and guidelines you've set forth. It's a great way to show people for a variety of reasons, be it implicit within the policy or something outside of the policy, things that relate back to the 5 core documents. Also, on a side note, what's really kind of cool about a policy is if you're ever applying for a job, what does that say? Do is it a good fit for you? So there's lots of reasons to review the policy for its intended purposes as well as its unintended purposes.
Thanks, Jackie. And Elise, I think you're going to help us define the difference between policies, procedures, and plans.
Right, thank you. One of the reasons that I like to talk about this is because I find in my work with a lot of other museums that specifically they don't understand the difference between policies and plans, and often they will mash together policies and procedures. So some brief definitions. A policy establishes the standards for decision making and makes the guidelines for taking action in a given situation. It evolves as the institution or standards and best practices change. It's not time limited, and it must be approved by the governing authority. A plan maps out the goals and objectives. It lays out the steps and identifies the resources that are needed to achieve the goals and objectives. It is time limited. You achieve your goals, reach your objectives, and you move on to establish a new plan. So the plan specifies what will be accomplished in a given period, why, by whom, and with what resources. It's a strategic plan. A collections plan is a strategic plan. So it lays out the goals and objectives necessary to fulfill the goals related to collections activities. And when you talk about the resources in a plan, you want to include both financial and human resources. Now last, the procedures specify the mechanisms and details needed to implement the policy. So they're step-by-step instructions on how to perform an activity or how to carry out a project. Procedures are subject to frequent revision, and unlike the policy that has to be approved by the governing authority, procedures can be changed and revised by designated staff members who have been given the authority to change them. All right, back to Cecilia.
Thank you, Elise. Let's head over to the chat box really quick and just look at some of the reasons that the 17% we had in the poll don't currently have a collections policy. It looks like a lot of museums are newer museums that possibly are just starting up and looking for some advice on how to write this policy. So we're glad you all are here. And it looks like we had one person. Oh yes, Sharon Sullivan said they had one about 20 years ago, but it wasn't quite what they needed. So they're looking for some support on that.
And I think there's a couple in here that say that collections is secondary to programmatic issues. And then our colleague in Utah talks about the old one being so vague to the point of uselessness, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, and we'll touch on some of those issues too about making the policy very specific to your institution as well.
I was going to point out too that, like you said, Cecilia, Shannon mentioned that it was generic and not specific, which is really important, as we'll talk about.
And Anne Kuchis from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, said their parent organization has one, but they need one that's specific to their site collection. Absolutely. I think that's really important. So let's talk a little bit about what the standards and required elements of a collections management policy are. You know, and presenters, as I go through these, feel free to jump in at any point. Currently, the standards state that a current approved comprehensive collections management policy should be in effect and actively used to guide the museum's stewardship of its collection. The museum really needs to have human resources that are sufficient and the staff have the appropriate education and training to fulfill the museum's stewardship responsibilities and
Cecilia, this is Elise. I'd like to make a comment. Again, something that I find commonly is that people always think about the financial resources, but as you've pointed out here, it's really important to think about the human resources that need to be, that are necessary to carry out activities.
Great, thank you. Let's head back. Documentation, records management, inventory are all very important elements of the policy, and these should be in the policy in effect to describe each object and its acquisition, the current location, the current condition, movement into, out of, and within the museum. So that's what the documentation and records management helps you do. Museum also should regularly monitor environmental conditions and take proactive measures to mitigate the effects of ultraviolet light, fluctuations in temperature and humidity, air pollution, damage, pests, natural disasters, and so on. So you should be taking some measures to monitor and mitigate those issues. You should also have an appropriate method for identifying needs and determining priorities for conservation and care, as well as have safety and security procedures in place for collections in the custody of the museum. That includes items on loan as well as the museum's permanent collections. And you should have something that addresses the museum's disaster preparedness as well for the collections. You need to have a regular assessment of and planning for collection needs. It needs to take place and have sufficient financial and human resources for collections stewardship. Also need to include collections care policies and procedures for collections on exhibit, in storage, on loan, and also during travel when your collections are outside of your museum. So the scope of a museum's collection stewardship also extends to both the physical and intellectual control of the property. It needs to include, as we were saying, the documentation as well as the physical, looking at the light levels and the environmental impact. And you need to include ethical considerations in there as well. And I think that Elise was going to touch on some of the requirements for ethics as well.
Right. And before I go to that, I have a comment about intellectual control. One thing I've noticed and something that we've had to think about in a natural history museum is we always thought, oh, well, we don't have to worry about copyright or intellectual control because our objects are old, they don't have copyright. But we found recently that it's more important for us to control intellectual property, such as the things that result out of the research, photographs, data, issues like that we really had to write a new intellectual property control policy, actually. So I just wanted to point that out because some people don't think about that.
Good point, Elise.
Okay, now, so in terms of ethics, I love what Malero said. She has a statement in her legal book. Professional standards, ethics are professional standards that uphold the integrity of the profession. And some of the issues related to ethics and collecting are collecting itself. We have to pay attention to the sensitivity of indigenous material. We have to think about the laws related to endangered species. How do we influence the commercial market? And we have to be careful about that as well. There's issues related to personal collecting and working at a museum. Issues related to conflicts of interest. So, for example, you don't want to compete with the museum for acquisitions. There's a lot of issues related to deaccessioned materials, one of which is the fact that museum staff should not be able to purchase or take possession of materials that have been deaccessioned from the museum. Other issues relate to personal activities. So whenever you go out as a representative of the museum, you need to understand that people will view the museum by your actions. And that's something you have to think about, be professional. And but in terms of the collections management policy, all of those kinds of issues need to be considered, and a section on ethics needs to be included in the policy. Back to Cecilia.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It was a very succinct statement on why ethics should be included in collections management policy. Now, we're going to talk specifically about the required elements for a collections management policy. And every institution is different. And the museum's policy should reflect that. But there are several items that most, if not all, museums should include in their specific policies. Acquisitions and accessioning, very important to include in the policy because you need these elements to determine how you are going to acquire the materials in your collection. Deaccessioning and disposal, you need these because you may not always have the same mission that you started off with 50 years ago. And some of your objects may no longer meet your museum's needs. So you need policies on how to deal with those objects. And also the use of the deaccession proceeds is important, because if you don't lay out how you're going to use that money, if you receive any from deaccessioning and disposal of collections, you may end up with a conflict of interest type situation, or even a legal situation that could present itself. Loans, incoming and outgoing, are very important to include in your policy, because if you are borrowing objects, you need to lay out how that process will occur. If you are lending objects out as well, you need to lay out those policies. As I was saying earlier, in the standards, you need to include how you're going to care for and manage those collections. Having a system of periodic inventories, it really helps with making sure that you know where all of the objects are, where, and when was the last time you did a full inventory or partial inventory of the collections, and how frequently are you going to do that? Should be included in the policy. You need to include sections on what types of documentation you're going to include about objects. Are you going to have deeds of gift, loan agreements, those types of things? And statements on access and use of the collection. Will researchers be allowed access? Of course, most probably you're going to have exhibition-related access to the collections and so on. So it's good to point out in the policy what your access and the public's access is to your collection.
And Cecilia, this is Greg. I wanted to pause for just a moment and point out a comment from my colleague Jill Connors-Joyner here, who is in charge of the Museum Assessment Program, who wants everybody in the audience to know that many museums use MAP to help them as they start to review their policies and to get better clarity on their collections issues, a lot of what you're talking about. And as Elise talked about a little bit earlier, when we're talking about standards, we're not talking about AAM standards. We're talking about standards that have been developed across, for, and by the field.
Exactly. Yeah, the Alliance simply disseminates the standards to the field. We collaborate them and then disseminate them back to the field. So they're not coming from the mountain on high. They're coming from you out there in the trenches.
Thank you, Greg and Cecilia, for clarifying that. I realized after I said that it might be taken the wrong way.
No, I think it offered us the opportunity to clarify that, absolutely. And of course, your collections policy should be reviewed and approved by your governing authority. That's very important, since they have the fiduciary responsibility for those objects and really need to know what's going on with them. Do any of the presenters have any comments about any of these required elements? Why is it important to have the accessioning or the use of proceeds? Any of those?
This is Courtney. I just want to talk about the deaccessioning and the use of proceeds. This has come up with us. We very rarely do deaccessioning, but it is a good way to make sure we have where the proceeds are going back into purchase of new collections, the growth of the collection. And there have been times when people have talked about taking the money for something else, but we can refer to a collections management policy, and we make sure the money goes back into the collection where we want it to go.
That's a perfect example of why it's important. Yes, absolutely.
This is Jackie. Just one more thing to add to what was just said. Deaccessioning is not a dirty word. It is part of what we do, and the more we have the documentation set us forth on that right path, it's just clearer and it makes it much better. But it's just something we deal with. And everybody that doesn't acknowledge that is making it harder for themselves.
So true. Very true.
This is Elise. One thing I'd like to point out with access and use of collections, as we all know about NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and now more so the importance of indigenous rights, we're really having to look at how we allow people to access and use the collections, the sensitive collections that we have.
Yeah, that's very, very important to include in a policy statement.
Oh, this is Courtney. About the access. We currently have very limited access to our off-site storage. We're currently building a new storage facility connected to our museum, and there's been talk about doing tours and things like that. So I'm looking at assessing the access part of our policy, because I'm concerned about that changing, having a new building and tours and things like that, and really putting it in fine detail of if there are tours, how things will work.
I see Simone Belts from Frisco Historic Park and Museum had a question about whether an inventory policy can exist within or under the collections care and handling section. Any comments on that? Well, I think, this is Cecilia, I think you could include the inventory policy under collections care and handling if that works for your institution. And now Jackie is going to talk a little bit about her own collections management policy at the Science Museum of Minnesota.
Well, thanks, Cecilia. Back to what Simone was talking about too, I think, every collections policy has its mandates of what goes in there, but every collections policy is very different as well. So as long as you build it to meet your needs, wherever you put these things, as long as you can find them and they're accessible, I think it's all good. I wanted to talk about my policy statement for a couple reasons. First, to out myself, you notice it says approved by the Board of Trustees in December of '04, and it's now 13. So those of you who have outdated policies, I am also one of you. A lot of things in this policy I think are really, really good, but from conversations earlier too, things change. Things need to be updated, and this is a great example. I mean, I've got NAGPRA in here, I've got deaccessioning, I've got all kinds of things, but I also don't have anything about technology's impact on what we do now, so that speaks to some of that copyright and some of the other things that need to be added in there. Outdated thoughts and new rules come about, so I would even say no more than every 3 years you should talk about redoing your policy, reviewing it, editing, updates. You don't want to do it constantly because your board won't be happy, but it's also something not to keep too far from their view. The more they see it, the more they understand it, the better it is for everybody. The other component within the policy that I like, not so much that it's mine, but I like it when it's on people's websites. I really think it's important as we move in this new world of technology that we can have instantaneous gratification to see who's got a policy. Hey, maybe they've got some ideas on theirs that I can use in mine or whatever. So putting up online, making transparent, I think is really key to all of that. One thing that I think should be a mandate, this is just me speaking, I think a policy, like all the other core documents, ought to have a definition section. I really think it's important that we all speak the same terminology. For whatever reason, we love A's and M's in our world. But we need to be consistent in our thought and our conversations, and I think sometimes people reading these documents might not have that same understanding. So whatever you use as your term, make sure you have a definition in the back that can speak to that so everybody's on the same, talking about the same thing at the same time. There's a publication that I use from, museum-wide, from Spinach, from the Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections, and I think it's great. There might be something else you guys use, but definitions are key. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Make sure you've got one going on, even if it's outdated. It's sometimes better than not. I know John Simmons will hate me when I say this, but he's got a fabulous book on things great and small. But in it he says, don't look at other people's policies when you're writing your own. I kind of think it's okay. I think it's good to see what other people are doing because you might have missed something. I also think if you don't have one, what a great way to get your handle around what it is you need to do. So I'm all for it. Share everything. That's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Jackie. And, I'm going to put a plug in here for the Alliance Information Center that if you're a Tier 3 museum member, you get free access to sample documents. And one of the documents that we have that is plentiful in the Information Center is collections management policies for all different sizes and types of museums. So if you're a Tier 3 member, head to the Information Center and get some sample documents. I can't speak highly enough for that.
Yeah, I'll double that. This is Jackie again. Those are fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, and this is Elise. I'll agree. And I have a comment, Jackie, on what you said. I totally agree with looking at other institutions' policies to get some useful ideas. I think the bad part of doing that is remember not to cut and paste, but to take the ideas and then mold them to fit your own institution. But I look at other people's policies all the time when I'm having to help develop a new one.
Great. Yeah, exactly. Don't reinvent the wheel, but make it fit your car. All right. I think, Elise, you were going to talk a little bit about the typical steps to writing a collections management policy.
Right. Thanks, Cecilia. The first step is to have the powers that be, for example, the director, assemble a committee or a team that's going to write the policy. And the team should include representatives from all areas of the museum that interrelate with collections activities. So people from administration, collections, of course, exhibits, education, and security, to name just a few. It's the input from the variety of viewpoints that will ensure that a policy supports the institutional mission and that it supports and that staff members will support it as well. One of the next steps is to look at the museum's mission. Any policy, including a collections management policy, should not be written before reviewing the mission statement because it's the museum's mission that drives everything else that it does. Then you should do a review of policies and laws, both internal and external. So the museum's own policies and procedures that the institution already has in place, because these will have an impact on how the collections management policy is written. And look at current legal, ethical, and professional standards and best practices because those also will have an impact on the development of the policy. You need to review the scope of collections. Again, you can't write a policy to manage the collections if you don't know what the collection consists of. Usually the scope of collections tells you not only what's in the collection, but if you have different types of collections like permanent collections, teaching collections, hands-on collections, and so forth. And the collections management policy should address standards for all of these different types of collections. In terms of staff responsibilities, the policy should address who is responsible for what, and especially who has the authority to make decisions and who has the authority to approve activities such as approving the policy itself or approving deaccessions, approving acquisitions, and so on. After you've done all that, you need to write the first draft. The first draft is then circulated to all of the institution's staff for review and comment. You can also circulate it to your governing authority if you wish for their input. Once you get comments back, you revise the first draft. You then again circulate that draft for further review and comment, and the process is repeated until a consensus is reached and the team feels that the policy is ready to be presented to the governing authority for approval. One thing I'd like to point out is, and we discussed a little bit ago, that collections policies are living documents. They cannot be stagnant. You can't just put them on a shelf and forget about them. If they're outdated, they will be ignored and they will be useless. They should be reviewed and updated on a predetermined periodic basis, say every 3 to 5 years, or whenever you have a radical change, like a renovation, a construction of a new facility, even if that event falls before the time of the regular update. And I think at this point, Courtney was going to discuss a little bit about the update that she's been doing with her institution.
Yes, I was not involved in the initial writing of the policy, but that was done in 1988. But we have grown as an organization since then. We have gone from a small historical society to a large history museum with 2 satellite museums. So we've had changes in the scope of collection. staff responsibilities. And our mission statements even changed. So we've had to change our policy to go with all that that's been going on. We also have a new facility that I mentioned before that's opening up. So as things are happening, I'm taking notes and working on a new policy to address all these issues. We've also had talks with our archives. And really, we have a library and archives and museum collection, same building, stored separately, maintained separately. I'd like to address the archives more because they've been sort of left out of the plan before. So really involving them, getting some more details about their security and their issues that they have that may be separate from the museum. But we want everything in our organization under one policy. But I think it's very important to just keep, there are things that come up, make notes of them, and to work on updating your policy whenever it fits for you. Ours is every 5 years currently. I might make that 3 years, just depending on how things go. But I really think it is important to just keep updating it.
Thank you, Courtney. And it's important to remember that standards change over time, so you need to keep abreast of what's happening there and include those within your collections policy. And museums evolve and grow, as Courtney was just saying. They went from a smaller historical society type museum to a larger multi-site institution. And new issues arise that you hadn't initially thought to include in a policy.
Yeah, like I mentioned, tours of our storage area. We never talked about that before. We didn't do it, but now with a new 9-story building, everyone's gung-ho and getting the public in those spaces, and I really want to make sure we have it in writing so we have a plan in place if it does go through, that we don't have any security in place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, this is Greg. I want to also pause and take this opportunity to note that Jackie Hoff, at our last annual conference in Minneapolis, gave a great behind-the-scenes tour of the collection storage facility at your museum, which was amazing. And wondering if you have any policies in place that regulate how the public gets access to that space.
And just make sure to unmute your line. You might have your audio muted at the moment.
Yeah, no, Greg, I think that's totally right. Thank you tons. It is a great space, but things do change over time, and around here they seem like they change monthly. So we always have to go back to our policies and procedures to understand what we've set, what we want to change, and sometimes what we don't want to change, and how we want to maintain some control over that. So that document is very, very useful. Even mine being outdated, I haul around with me all the time.
Well, I'd like to take a couple of moments to address some questions that have come in the chat box over the last few minutes. One from Rodrigo, who wants to know why we should keep intellectual property control over natural history research. The whole point of science, explicitly at public institutions, is the free sharing of information for the betterment of mankind. Elise, maybe you can talk about that.
Yes. It's not that we don't not want to share our research. It's that during certain stages of the research, like the initial collecting of the data from the museum specimens, for various reasons, that has to be kept secure and under control. For example, until the scientist doing the research has published the information. So it's not, again, not that we don't want to share the information. It's just that there's a time at which that becomes what you need to do. So that's why we have to control the use of the information before it's ready to become public.
Thanks, Elise. We also had a question from Jesse De La Cruz in Denver. Do museum collections policies that have large archival collections create a sub-collection policy for archival records and manuscripts within the overall museum collection? Would anyone who has developed one similar be willing to share this with us? I specifically know that a lot of museums that have archival collections do include them in their collections management policy. Again, if that works for your institution to include them all together, I would say go for that. But if it makes more sense to have an archival collections policy and then a object collections policy, depending on how you treat those archival collections, it's really up to your institution. Any other comments on that question?
This is Courtney. Since I've been working on our archival, collection with our museum collection, I've seen both. I've seen them together. I've seen them apart. So that's something I've been researching also, and it would be great to see what other people have too.
And the same goes for John Judge's question about combining archive and library policies. I think if it works for your institution, you should include them all in one policy. But if you would find it easier to access the information for all of those different collections, I wouldn't separate every collection in your institution, but libraries have very specific requirements, as do archival collections. So if it works for your institution, go for that. And the Information Center does have sample documents that they can provide to Tier 3 museums that include those types of things.
Great.
Yeah, this is Jackie. I 100% agree. I think it really does depend on the organization structure that you have, but I would caution everybody to not create a bazillion policies. You'll lose track of them, and that could ultimately be really, really bad.
Yeah, you need to definitely be able to access that information. So as long as it works for your institution. All right, we're going to move on to using the collections policy as a tool for your institution. We have a quick audience question. Who can answer this question? The collections management policy can be used as a strategic planning tool, a tool for grant writing, a tool for risk assessment, all of the above, and more. Everybody got that question right. I didn't expect anybody not to. Okay, and how can we use the collections policy as a strategic planning tool, Jackie?
I really think that it should be seriously in your pocket at every meeting that you're discussing where you are and going forward. Your mission, your what you're going to put in your galleries, what you plan on collecting. Everything about this collections policy is so useful on so many levels. I encourage you to read it often. It's for even reasons you don't even know about. But the basic thing that I like it for, it actually steers you back into what your core mission is and where you want to be and what you want to do when you grow up. I really think this is a board-approved document. You spent a lot of time and thought putting it together. Make the best use of it as you possibly can. For the grant writing component of it alone is worth its weight in gold. Any kind of implementation, bringing new staff on, anything that's to do with your organization as a whole, this policy can help you tremendously.
Great, and as Jackie was just saying, using the collections policy as a grant writing tool is a great way to utilize this document. You can use the scope of collection statement itself as, a cut and paste into a grant proposal. And when you have the policy in place, you can often say that in your grant proposal, we have this policy in place and it shows a certain level of stewardship of collections because of the simple fact that you have that. I think it's really important to understand that all of these kinds of documents, the collections policy, the institutional plan or strategic plan, can be used and utilized in these ways. Elise, do you want to talk a little bit about how the policy can be used as a risk assessment tool?
Sure. For us, the way we use it, and in general, the way you can use it, is you need to know first the collections that you have, and then how you've laid out these principles and guidelines in your collections management policy to help you determine what kinds of risks are associated with the collections that you have. For example, how do you protect a military collection that might include ammunition? What do you do with live collections in the event of a disaster? And it's the guidelines that are laid out in the collections management policy that'll help you make decisions about these kinds of issues. For example, after a disaster, you may have to use the guidelines for deaccessioning or disposal to get rid of some objects that have been damaged. You hope that you don't have to do that, but you might have to. You can't write an emergency plan that tells you how to prepare the collections for disaster and how to take care of them afterwards if you don't have the guidelines from the collections management policy for managing them. So back to Cecilia.
Thank you. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how the policy intersects with all areas of the museum. So how does the policy intersect with exhibitions? If you don't have any statements in the policy related to how objects will be used and how access to them will be, it can really affect how exhibitions are presented, how objects are cared for while on exhibition. And if your facilities do not meet the needs of the collections, then you're going to have issues with care and stewardship as well. So if you have statements in your policy about the levels of environmental controls that you need and the light levels, things like that, you'll very much be better able to care for and manage your collections. The collections policy also should include those human resources, the collection staff, but not just the collection staff, the curatorial staff or the financial management staff. You should include statements in there about how all of these areas relate to the collections. And are there any other areas that you can think of, speakers, that should be woven into the collections policy?
Cecilia, this is Jackie. I can't think of anything right offhand, but the moment you don't have it with you is when you wish you would. So any type of a conversation you have that impacts your organization as a whole, I would pull out that policy and have a read through.
Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about who should be involved in the process. And I'm going to ask the speakers questions about who they involved in the process during their creation or revision of the policy. The 5 or 6 types of people I can think of off the top of my head are, of course, the director should be included in the process of writing the policy, the collection staff, other staff in the museum. I think it was Elise or Jackie was talking earlier about facility staff, security staff, those kinds of people. Of course, the board needs to be involved, but who else needs to be included in the process?
This is Elise. One thing that we have to think about, we're a university museum, plus we're a state museum. And so when we are writing policies, we have to include people in the administration of the museum, like the provost. He doesn't have to necessarily sit on the committee and be involved all the time, but he has to see the drafts and he has to review the draft. We also have to pass the policies on to some of our state representatives. We have a division of cultural resources in the state government, and we have to, at certain times of the process, include them as well.
This is Jackie. On a little more general topic, I guess, as you're going through the process, while it might not impact the entirety of your organization on a day-to-day basis, as you process through it and you have milestones that you have met, I would encourage you all, if you have a small staff, to have a 15-minute meeting and just not get into details, but let people have a clue of what it is you're doing and why. And if you have a large staff and that's impossible, send an all-staff email out keeping people involved, invested in the understanding that you're actually creating a process is equally important, even if it doesn't directly impact them.
This is Elise. We were talking the other day actually about emergency plans and volunteers. And sometimes it's a good idea, especially in a smaller museum that uses a lot of volunteers, to include them in the process as well. Or at least, as Jackie had said, have them sit in on these meetings so that they know what's going on and how they're going to be impacted by it.
That's a great point. I think volunteers should definitely be included in the process, or just listening into the process, because they are a stakeholder that is involved in that aspect of the museum. So let's move on to who have you shared the policy with. Obviously, if it's been approved, you've shared it with the board. Hopefully, you will share it with all of the staff, not just the collection staff. Maybe you want to share it with the community. As Jackie said, she has hers on the website, so it's available for the entire community, not just her local community, but the worldwide web community. Visitors may find this document interesting and helpful if you have elements on access in there and how they can access collections. But who else should be included?
This is Jackie. I strongly encourage everyone to use it when they're working with granting agencies and donors as well.
Yep.
This is Elise. I was going to say donors as well. And again, also mention the fact that we have to share it with our university administration and the state officials.
And this is Cecilia again. I really think it can also be used as a great tool, as I said, for you want to share it with the board, but it can be a training tool for the board as well, and it can be a training tool for volunteers who are going to be working with the collection.
Cecilia, this is Greg. Tell me what that means, using it as a training tool for the board and your volunteers.
I think it can be used as a tool for training in that it should include a lot of information about how the museum expects its collections to be managed, and it gives those reading it an understanding of what might be expected in the handling and management of those collections.
This is Courtney. I agree with you when you talk about the teaching tool, training tool, because we have a lot of people that don't, or new staff that come in to train, volunteers that don't understand exactly how the museum works, and why can't you just give collections to, say, a person down the street to borrow, or why aren't you taking something from a historic object? But they don't understand why we do what we do, and having them look through this policy and understand what's going on really can be helpful, I think. Not with staff, volunteers, and the board.
This is Elise. I think it's a good training tool too, in that you can also introduce ethics and legalities to your volunteers and your donors through that policy.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I think we have another audience question. And I think we're pulling up the interactive tool for this, but what are some strategies that you out there in the audience have used in writing your collections policy that worked for your institution?
Great, and you can type your response into the Q&A chat box on the left side of the screen, or you're welcome to use the chat box we're dropping here on the screen now. And your response will appear immediately there, so feel free to type in either place.
Thanks, Adam. I wonder if, Simone, you could elaborate a little bit on how you have found the policy used in mentorship a little bit more. I like Valerie's comment there about feedback from staff across the museum and sharing it with museums and resources in the area.
This is Elise. I love Sarah's comment, too, about contacting retired leaders, getting that corporate memory to help you. That's a great idea.
Yeah, excellent.
Someone mentioned mentorship. We have an affiliates program, sort of like the Smithsonian has an affiliates program. Ours is on a smaller level, but part of the program is helping people with their policies and plans and cataloging, anything to do with collections care. If they have questions, we're there to help them and do workshops and talks and things. It's great for the small museums. It's free.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And thanks, Simone, for elaborating a little bit. Appreciate that.
And while we're letting people type some of their responses in, I do want to point out that a number of you in the audience are exchanging email addresses and resources with each other, which is a terrific thing, I think. So thank you for doing that.
Okay, I think we'll move on to some of the specific successes and challenges that our speakers have had in developing their or revising their own policies. So, of Elise, Jackie, and Courtney, who was involved in development process, and would you include or exclude others next time?
This is Courtney. I guess I'll talk about this real quick. Our museum division director, our collection staff, which is only 2 people, and I think that then the beginning of the process, of course, the board and our collections committee sees it once we're finished. I think when we're doing it this time, I'd like to include our library and archives department more because they really weren't a part of it before, but addressing their issues and concerns along with ours, I think having them included would be a really good thing.
And Courtney, why is that, you think?
That they weren't included, or would be a good thing?
No, yeah, why it would be a good thing for them?
Because a lot of their issues, they have some issues with security and access, which are different than our access because people come into archives to do research. So talking about the security is a little bit different for them and access, and just some other items in general that they're concerned about that maybe are a little bit different than objects. They have a lot more things scanned in now, so dealing with those issues. It's a little different than objects. It's not addressed in our current policy.
Thanks.
This is Jackie. My comment would be, more is good, but at some point, depending upon the size of your organization, then no one's doing any work or everybody is focusing on one thing, and many times you don't have the means to do that. I'm at the other end of the extreme. I'm such a large organization that holding a meeting would just be insane. So one of the things we did when we first started developing the policy was to have a very small group within the collections component here, do some basic framework, and then we brought people in to, kind of add to it, change it, ask questions about it, and then we continued to add people as needed, if you will, and that way make sure to get a really good visual from everybody of what in the world they needed to do. But ultimately, we had almost everybody, and at the end, obviously the board approves it, but we had securities, facilities, exhibits people. We had obviously everyone in collections and conservation. So take it as you will with the number of people that you have, but don't make it so onerous you get nothing done.
This is Elise. Jackie, we did something similar where we had a smaller group develop a revision of the policy, and then pass that around and actually had a larger committee then work on redrafting after that. We're such a large museum, we have different divisions to deal with different disciplines. And so we basically first had to start with representatives from every one of the disciplines. So anthropology, birds, mammals, fossils, and develop it that way, and then bring in people from education and exhibits, the security people, because you're right, it would have been too onerous to try to start with all those people. You have meetings for months and months and months and never get anything accomplished.
And I think, this is Cecilia, and I think for a smaller institution that has maybe one or two staff members, starting with a draft of something and then maybe going out and speaking with other museums in your area and providing them with the draft to review for you or help you with is also a good tool to use your colleagues in the community.
This is Elise. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is for small museums as well, especially those that are just volunteer run. You can create a committee by calling on people from other museums or bringing in a consultant to help. Of course, with a consultant, sometimes there's an issue of being able to find the funds to pay the consultant, but that's another topic. But if you do bring in a consultant, you need to make sure that that person really does understand how the museum operates, what the collections are like, how the collections interact with the other areas of the museum, so that they get a good feel and really write a policy that will fit with your institution. But there's nothing to say that you can't call in representatives from other museums to serve on those committees for the short run.
That's a really great idea. Can you all give us maybe some of the challenges that you had in developing or revising your policy? Was there a lot of pushback from any particular segment?
This is Jackie. Okay, I'll out myself again, by golly. Exhibits, those darn people, they just want into everything. So having to construct something that met both sides in an equal manner, that everybody felt vindicated and validated in their concerns, was really, really strenuous and hard to do. But I think at the end of the day, when it was all said and done, everybody was really happy. So that was the biggest challenge that I've had.
Well, that wasn't too bad.
This is Elise. One of the challenges that we have sometimes when we write our policies or revise them is getting people from the different divisions to feel that including a certain section, for example, on NAGPRA, is important. People that are working with the fossils could care less about NAGPRA and don't know why they have to spend time, if they're on the committee, helping us develop that for the policy or why it should be included. So we've had those kinds of issues to deal with. And then just dealing with new things that come up like NAGPRA, although it's not new anymore, of course, but when that law was passed and we had to start thinking about how we wanted to treat the collections based on what we were required to do for NAGPRA. And we had to revise the collections policy because of it. And it's a little bit of a challenge because it requires changing your thinking and adopting new theoretical standpoints.
And Elise, did you find that after the policy was finished, that those folks that maybe did give a little bit of pushback now had a better understanding of why the importance of NAGPRA in particular?
Right. I think some, and I know even though the director knew it was important beforehand, he realization of what the museum's role had to be nationally and what the museum's role had to be legally by going through the process.
So a little bit of a success there in
yes.
training,
yeah.
training or teaching.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Any other major successes in the policy writing or revising? Just getting it done.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really think that by when you work to craft a document that meets your need, the mission and the goal and everything that the organization is working on, and you share that document internally with staff who either are working in conjunction with the collections or not, the more information as an organization you hold, the stronger of an organization that you become and create. So I think it's a wonderful thing to share with everybody.
I was looking over in the chat box, and I see that Esther Bali, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, from the Bellevue Arts Museum. They are a non-collecting museum and wonder if they should create a policy just to cover borrowed objects and what that should look like. Esther, this is Cecilia. I really think that you should develop a policy for how you will manage and care for the borrowed objects that you will have. It's important to lay those policies out on paper and in writing, because you're probably going to want to go to the museum or whoever individual that you are borrowing those collections from, so they understand how their materials are going to be cared for. And if you ever do apply for core documents verification, it is one of the required documents for that program if you are a non-collecting institution. Any other thoughts on non-collecting museums from our panelists?
I guess one of the things that I might suggest, this is Jackie, is to take a peek at the overarching document that we use for the facilities reports and see how you can incorporate that into your answers and comments if you do create something. The general facilities report is something that we trade back and forth with each other to find out what's going on and who's doing what and security and everything else, but that might be a great resource to take a peek at.
Yeah, that's a great resource, and it's available on the Alliance website in our bookstore. So with that, we're going to reiterate that the standards are very important to include in your collection policy. In plain English, the standards again are: know what stuff you have, know what stuff you need, know where it is, take good care of it, make sure someone gets some good out of it, especially people you care about and your neighbors. And we have the link for the ethics standards and best practices, the national standards and best practices on our website. And just a reminder that Tier 3 Alliance Museum members receive a free e-copy of the standards and best practices for U.S. Museum book. So you can ask us how you can get that copy for your benefit. Here are some online resources that we have for the core documents verification program, but that are available for anyone to access on our website. The Developing a Collections Management Policy Reference Guide is a new guide that we developed. It's very informative. I think it's pretty helpful when you're developing a policy, so take a look at that. Again, the National Standards and Best Practices for U.S. Museums is a great resource. There's also an Acquisitions and Deaccessioning Activity Guide on the Core Documents Verification web pages that you can use to help determine how best to incorporate acquisitions and deaccessioning into your museum practices and policies. So all of those things are available on our website.
And Cecilia, I just want to point out that there's a tremendous amount of resources related to all the core documents that are available to anyone who comes to the website, whether you're a member or not.
Exactly, yeah. And a lot of them are new resources that were specifically developed for the program, but anyone is welcome to use those. And here are just a couple of the examples: the Developing a Collections Management Policy and the Accessioning Activity. And of course, we have a lot of other resources online through our bookstore. The AAM Guide to Collections Planning. I think someone else in the chat had asked whether you should incorporate your collections plan into your collections policy, and I would really recommend keeping those two separate documents. Any of the panelists have a opposing view or a confirming view on that?
This is Elise. I totally confirm your view, Cecilia. They should not be the same document.
Yeah, this is Jackie. I second that emotion. Yeah.
And this is Courtney. I agree. Ours used to be together, and then I separated them. And it's definitely working a lot better that way.
Why did you decide to separate them?
It was very confusing. We had people and different departments confused about what was what, and the collecting plan seems to change more often. So we wanted to keep them separate.
Thank you. As someone else mentioned earlier, Museum Registration Methods 5th edition by Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore is the Registrar's Bible, basically. Everything you ever wanted to know about collections management is in that book. John Simmons' Great Things, Great and Small, all about writing collections management policies, is a very helpful resource. And then Collections Conundrums, a great read for those of you interested in kind of quirky collections related issues. A lot of good information in that book as well. As I said, these are available in the AAM bookstore. And if you are coming to the Alliance annual meeting in May, we are going to be having a special first time for us core document review clinics. They're going to be Monday through Wednesday, May 20th through 22nd, 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. in the Convention Center. And you could bring or send us one of the core documents. You can choose whichever one you want of the 5, the mission statement, collections policy, strategic institutional plan, or emergency disaster preparedness plan, or code of ethics. And we will have expert reviewers. They are experienced peer reviewers who will be reviewing the document and then giving you in-person feedback. So if you're coming to the annual meeting, we welcome you to sign up for one of these review clinics. Just send me an email. I believe my email will come up in a moment, but let me give it to you here. It's CWALLS@aam-us.org, and I'm happy to chat with you about any of the things we've discussed today or core document clinics at the annual meeting. And to reiterate, these are the 5 core documents that are in the Core Documents Verification Program. It's based on the Continuum of Excellence. These are, again, what you get from participating. And we also have a lot of related webinars in our recorded library devoted to collections and collections policies. And I'll give another plug for our wonderful information center, which has those sample documents for Tier 3 museums. These are some of the resources you can get at the various levels of membership. 24/7 access to online resources, access to the sample documents if you're a Tier 3 museum member, as well as customized research service. So if you have a question that you can't find the answer to and you're a Tier 3 museum member, send an email to infocenter@aam-us.org and they can help you out. And Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the Alliance membership structure.
Great. Thanks, Cecilia. As many of you may know, we changed our membership structure here at the Alliance, along with our name and our brand and our logo this last fall, in an effort to make the benefits of membership available to more institutions and the people who work in them. So what you see right here is just a quick snapshot of the various benefits that are available to institutions at the highest level, Tier 3, the next level down at Tier 2. And then Tier 1 is the basics, which we call really the pay what you can institutional membership. So we really encourage you to take the opportunity to visit the website if you're not already a member and see what benefits are available to you at different levels. And if you are a member already, you may want to take a look and see what those benefits are to see how you can increase the benefits to your staff and your employees. So just want to take a moment to talk about that. I want to also take a moment to see if there are any questions that have come into the parking lot through our chat boxes that we haven't gotten to yet. I know there was a couple of comments earlier about intellectual property, a couple of questions about deaccessioning. So I wonder if folks and presenters, if you see any questions that we should address before we sign off.
This is Elise. I want to try to respond to Rodrigo again very quickly. And one of the examples I can use is naming a species. It's very prestigious for a scientist and for the institution that person works for to name a new species. A lot of museum specimens are used to revise species name and taxonomy, and that data needs to be kept secret before publication. So that's an example of why we control access to the data until publication. I hope that answers the question. And if you want to pursue the subject in further detail, I'd be happy to talk to you on the phone, or you could email me.
And Kaya Landon had asked, when will information on how STEPS coordinates with core documents verification and accreditation be available? We are working with IMLS to develop a document that will outline how STEPS will relate to the other programs on the continuum of excellence, and hopefully that will be coming out within this year sometime. Beyond that, I'm not sure I can answer that question.
Great, and just as we're taking a moment here to look at some of the questions that were submitted along the way, I want to make sure to launch this question pod in the top left corner of the screen for all of you. So as we near the end of the session today, if you could just take a quick moment to click on that yellow evaluation button. That will just launch a survey in your browser window, and we'd love to get your feedback on today's session. We're always looking at ways to shape the future ones, including new subjects. So please take a moment to fill that out for us before you sign out for today. And we'll take another look here at the questions pending from earlier in the session. Now, I think I'm going to highlight a few of the questions that came in here, and I know some of them our presenters were answering in chat. So if there's not much more to say on them, feel free to just make one comment or two. But I have here a question from Diane in Binghamton, New York, asking, could you speak more about intellectual control beyond copyright? And I know we were talking about a bit of that, but if you have any other comments.
This is Elise. I have another comment for Diane. Other things that fall under intellectual control, something like photographs, the use of photographs. We have a policy on how photographs can be used, and what we're trying to avoid is the inappropriate use of photographs. One of the best examples I heard about this was a historic house museum in Savannah. A person came and took a photograph through the bars that were at the gate and used it on the cover of a romance novel. And the Historic House Museum sued the publisher of the novel because they felt that that was a totally inappropriate use of the image of their museum. So that's just one example. I'm sure Jackie and Courtney might have others.
This is Courtney. We do have it in our policy about photographs of objects. Because one way that we do get money back into our budget for collections care is through the use of photographs of our objects. So we've had people use them in books and not credit us or have permission and other publications. And I think it's, we want to control how they're used, such as the romance novel issue, and also to get some, that's a way we can bring in some money for collections care.
Great, thank you. Dana in Grand Rapids has a question about deaccessioning, wondering, is it standard to cover shipping costs for a work that is donated to the museum using funds from deaccessioning?
This is Jackie. I'd love to cover this. I think one of the things, again, we go back to that whole deaccessioning being this bad word. Having the policy state what that exactly means instead of, direct collections care, to some extent that could be a light bulb. So depending upon how your organization works on your structures, I would strongly encourage you to not use just the term direct collections care and really be specific in how you word that to make everybody happy at the end of the day.
This is Courtney. I agree with you on that. Ours states that it will go into a fund, an acquisition fund for the growth of the collection, so only to purchase new collections. Very specific is good.
This is Elise. There are some regulations related to how you use funds from deaccessioning. We mentioned earlier related to national accounting standards. So if you do not capitalize your collection, that is, you do not assign values to them to use as an asset on your financial statement, which most of us do not for obvious reasons, then you can only use the funds for acquisition of new collections. And this is something that it's tricky to understand, and a lot of people don't understand it. When we went for reaccreditation, we had to revise our collections policy to take the statement out that we would use any funds from deaccessioning for collections care in general, and only use it for the acquisition of new collections.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, so much for your comments and feedback, and for everyone in the audience for joining us today. We are running out of time, so if you have any additional questions, please let us know. Our contact information is up on the screen right now for all of the presenters, and I know I speak for myself, but I'm willing to chat with any of you if you have additional questions. I think my fellow presenters feel the same way.
And Cecilia, thank you very much for wrapping that up so nicely, and thank you, Jackie and Courtney and Elise, for your participation today, and thank all of you in the audience for joining us. And as Adam mentioned a few moments ago, up in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see an evaluation link that you can use to go to an online evaluation. Your feedback is very important to us. I do also want to mention, as Cecilia talked about at the very beginning of our program, this is one of a series of programs in our core documents series. The next one is coming up on May 1st in celebration, if you will, of May Day, program on disaster preparedness and emergency response plans, followed in June by your institutional code of ethics, in September on your mission statement, and November 6th on institutional planning. We hope that you'll take the opportunity to join us for those programs as well. Not all of them are up on the website, the Alliance website yet, but they will be soon. But we encourage you to take a moment to visit the website to learn more about these programs. And I do want to take a moment, as I always do, to thank our fine colleagues at Learning Times for hosting, sponsoring, and producing this program. In particular, my colleague and friend, Adam Lafacci. Thanks for being such a great co-host, Adam.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thanks again to our presenters. It was a great session today.
And of course, Adam is backed up by a number of colleagues at Learning Times who are helping to keep the program run smoothly. So thank you to those of you behind the scenes, and of course to our colleagues, our closed captioners from WGBH, who always do such a nice job with captioning for us. With that, I'm going to close the program out, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time for our AAM webinar.